Sometimes, the most powerful moments happen when we think no one is watching. Sometimes, a single act of quiet determination can change two lives forever. Benjamin Weaver, a 63-year-old Amish carpenter, stood alone in his community's empty field where a beloved barn once stood. The spring storm had destroyed everything. While others talked about hiring help and using machines, Benjamin picked up his grandfather's old tools. He would rebuild this barn with his own hands, the way it was meant to be done. A sleek car pulled up to the road that morning, carrying David Richardson, a wealthy CEO from New York. He had come to buy land for a resort project, but something about watching this older man work with such skill and purpose made him stop. What would happen when these two very different worlds collided? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Lancaster County like a gentle blessing, softening the edges of a world that moved at the pace of horse hooves and human hearts. Benjamin Weaver had risen before dawn, as was his custom for the past 43 years, and now stood in the amber light of sunrise, surveying what remained of Miller's community barn. The foundation, stone's massive blocks of limestone that his great-grandfather had helped quarry and place, nearly a century ago, still held their ground with stubborn dignity. Everything above them had been reduced to scattered timber and twisted metal by the storm 3 days prior. The barn had been more than a building. It was where the community gathered for weddings, where young couples danced their first dance as husband and wife, where children played hide-and-seek among the hay bales during Sunday fellowship meals. Benjamin had proposed to his dear Ruth in this very barn 38 years ago, her cheeks flushed pink from the summer heat, and her eyes bright with the promise of a life together. She'd said yes while standing right where that split oak beam now lay broken. Benjamin's weathered, hand scarred from decades of honest work with wood and metal, traced the worn leather of his grandfather's tool belt. Each tool had its place, its purpose, its story. The hand plane that had shaped 1,000 boards, the chisels that had carved intricate joints, the square that ensured every corner was true. These weren't just instruments of carpentry. They were extensions of his soul, connections to generations of craftsmen who understood that work done with patience and reverence became something sacred. The sound of gravel crunching under tires interrupted his meditation. A sleek black sedan, so out of place in this pastoral setting, it might as well have been a spacecraft, pulled to a stop near the wooden fence that bordered the property. The engine's purr died, replaced by the gentle morning chorus of birdsong and distant lowing of cattle in the neighboring pasture. David Richardson stepped out of the car with the practiced efficiency of a man accustomed to owning every room he entered. At 46, he possessed the lean build and sharp edges of someone who lived on adrenaline and ambition. His Italian leather shoes, costing more than most of the families here spent on groceries in a month, looked absurdly impractical on the soft earth. He wore his success like armor, the perfectly tailored charcoal suit, the Swiss watch that could fund a small business, the smartphone that never stopped buzzing with urgent demands from a world that moved at digital speed. But something about the scene before him made David pause. He'd come to Lancaster County on a reconnaissance mission, scouting potential locations for Richardson Development Group's next luxury resort project. The rolling hills, pristine farmland, and quaint rural charm would appeal to wealthy urbanites seeking authentic experiences. His vision was clear: a 5-star resort with a spa, golf course, and conference facilities that would generate millions in revenue while providing guests with carefully curated glimpses of simple living. What he hadn't expected was to witness something that stopped him cold. The elderly man in the field moved with a purposefulness that transcended mere activity. Every motion was deliberate, economical, born from decades of muscle memory and deep understanding. Benjamin was sorting through the debris with the methodical care of an archaeologist, separating salvageable wood from ruined timber, setting aside bent nails that could be straightened and reused. The contrast couldn't have been starker. David's world was built on speed, efficiency, quarterly profits, and the relentless pursuit of growth. He commanded a team of architects, contractors, and project managers who could transform landscapes in months using the latest machinery and technology. Yet here was a man preparing to rebuild a barn with hand tools, working alone, taking what would certainly be weeks or months to accomplish. What modern construction could finish in days. Benjamin noticed the stranger, but didn't acknowledge him directly. In the Amish tradition, curiosity about outsiders was tempered by natural reserve and politeness. He continued his work, occasionally glancing toward the well-dressed man who seemed content to simply observe. There was something in the stranger's posture, a tension that suggested he was accustomed to motion, but was now forced into stillness. That stirred Benjamin's compassion. The morning wore on. David found himself mesmerized by the rhythm of Benjamin's work. The older man had begun measuring and marking salvageable beams with a precision that spoke of absolute confidence in his craft. There were no blueprints, no complicated calculations, just the quiet application of knowledge passed down through generations. Benjamin would run his hands along a piece of timber, feeling for flaws invisible to the untrained eye, then mark it with a pencil stub that looked ancient but worked perfectly. By mid-morning, other community members began arriving. Martha Yoder, a 70-year-old widow with sparkling eyes and a basket of fresh bread, approached Benjamin with the easy familiarity of lifelong friendship. Her presence seemed to give David permission to step closer to the fence, though he remained respectfully outside the property line. "The Englishman's been watching you work for near 2 hours," Martha observed in Pennsylvania Dutch, though her tone held no judgment, only gentle amusement. Benjamin nodded, not looking up from the beam he was examining. "He seems troubled by something beyond this place. Perhaps the Lord brought him here for a reason. Perhaps. Or perhaps he's simply lost." Martha smiled at Benjamin's quiet wit, then called out in English, "Good morning. You're welcome to come closer if you'd like. Benjamin doesn't bite, though. He might put you to work if you're not careful." David approached hesitantly, his expensive shoes making soft impressions in the damp earth. Up close, Benjamin appeared even more impressive, tall and lean, with the corded muscles of someone who'd spent his life in physical labor. His beard was steel gray, his face weathered but kind, his blue eyes holding depths that spoke of both joy and sorrow fully experienced. "I'm David Richardson," he said, extending his hand. Benjamin wiped his palm on his work pants before accepting the handshake. His grip was firm, calloused, honest. "Benjamin Weaver. This is Martha Yoder. You're far from the main road." "I was exploring the area. Business purposes, initially." David's voice trailed off as he looked at the foundation stones and scattered debris. "What happened here?" "Storm came through Tuesday night," Benjamin replied simply. "Took the barn, but left the foundation. That's something to be grateful for." David looked around at the destruction and struggled to understand how anyone could find gratitude in such loss. "Are you planning to rebuild?" "I am." "Alone?" Benjamin nodded, returning to his work. "It's how the barn was first built. My great-grandfather and 2 of his brothers raised the original structure in 1924. Family tradition, you might say." Martha studied David with the shrewd eyes of someone who'd raised 7 children and buried a husband. She saw something in this stranger's expensive clothes and restless energy that reminded her of her youngest son during his Rumspringa, searching, pretending to have all the answers while desperately needing guidance. "You look like a man who's forgotten how to be still," she said gently. "Benjamin's work is good medicine for that particular ailment." David felt heat rise in his cheeks. Her observation was uncomfortably accurate. When had he last simply stood, somewhere without checking his phone, answering emails, or planning his next move. Even on vacation, the few he'd taken in recent years, he'd remained tethered to his business, unable to fully disconnect from the constant demands of success. Benjamin straightened, studying a damaged beam. This piece is good wood still in it. The hardest sound just needs the damaged parts cut away. He glanced at David. Sometimes that's all any of us need, someone to see past the damaged parts to what's still sound underneath. The words hit David with unexpected force. How long had it been since anyone had looked at him and seen anything beyond his business success? His ex-wife certainly hadn't. His teenage son viewed him as an obligation, a source of financial support. But little else. His business associates saw him as a means to profit. His competitors saw him as a threat to defeat. But this stranger, this Amish carpenter who lived without electricity or modern conveniences, seemed to see something different. In Benjamin's presence, David felt the relentless noise in his head, beginning to quiet, replaced by something he'd almost forgotten existed: peace. The sun climbed higher, warming the morning air and bringing the sweet scent of wildflowers from the nearby meadow. David found himself reluctant to leave, though. He couldn't articulate why. His phone buzzed insistently in his pocket, but for the first time in years, he ignored it. Benjamin continued his methodical work, occasionally explaining what he was doing when David asked questions. There was no impatience in his teaching, no condescension towards someone who clearly knew nothing about carpentry or farming. He answered David's questions with the same careful attention he gave to examining each piece of wood dot as the morning drew toward noon. Martha packed up her empty bread basket and prepared to leave. "Benjamin, will you join us for Sunday dinner tomorrow? Rachel's making her famous pot roast." "I'll be here working, but thank you kindly." Martha turned to David. "You're welcome as well, Mr. Richardson. Our table always has room for one more." David felt a strange tightness in his chest at the casual invitation. When had anyone last invited him to dinner without ulterior motives? "That's very kind, but I wouldn't want to intrude." "No intrusion. Just neighbors being neighborly," Martha smiled. "Think about it." As she walked away, David realized he was already thinking about it. More than thinking, he was longing for it with an intensity that surprised him. The prospect of sitting around a family table, sharing a meal prepared with love rather than ordered from an expensive restaurant, felt like a half-remembered dream from his own childhood. Benjamin had returned to his work, seemingly content to continue in companionable silence. David watched the careful way he handled each piece of wood, the reverence with which he treated even the damaged beams. There was something deeply moving about witnessing such dedication to craft, such commitment to doing things properly, regardless of time or convenience. The afternoon sun was growing warm when David finally forced himself to check his phone. 17 missed calls, 43 text messages, and an inbox full of urgent emails. His assistant had left increasingly frantic voicemails about a board meeting that had been moved up, a deal in Tokyo that was falling apart, and a conference call with investors that he'd already missed. The familiar spike of adrenaline shot through his system. This was his life constant: crisis management, perpetual urgency, the weight of expectations from dozens of people whose livelihoods depended on his decisions. He should be driving back to the city immediately, catching the first flight to Tokyo, doing damage control on multiple fronts. Instead, he found himself walking closer to where Benjamin worked, drawn by the older man's calm presence like a moth to flame. Benjamin looked up, noting the tension that had returned to David's posture, the way his jaw had tightened while reading his messages. "Troubles?" Benjamin asked quietly. "Always." David attempted a laugh that came out hollow. "The price of success, I suppose." Benjamin set down his tools and regarded David with thoughtful eyes. "My Ruth used to say that any success that costs you your peace isn't success at all. It's just expensive failure." The words landed with the force of revelation. David had built an empire, accumulated wealth beyond most people's dreams, earned the respect and envy of his peers. But peace? When had he last experienced genuine peace? She sounds like a wise woman. She was. 5 years gone this September, and I still hear her voice in quiet moments. Benjamin's expression softened with memory. She had a way of seeing, straight to the heart of things, cutting through all the noise and complications to what really mattered. What did she say mattered? Benjamin was quiet for a long moment, his hands resting on a piece of oak that would become part of the new barn's frame. Love, work that serves others, time spent with people who matter, building things that last beyond your own years. He looked directly at David. She would have said that the most important question isn't what you're building, but who you're building it for. David felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of tension he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it was there. He thought of his son Michael, now 17 and a stranger despite sharing the same DNA. He thought of all the buildings he'd constructed, all the deals he'd closed, all the profits he'd generated. But when had he last built something that truly mattered? When had he last worked not just for money, but for meaning? The sun was beginning its descent toward the western hills when David finally made his decision. Instead of rushing back to New York to manage his various crises, he would stay another day, maybe two. His business would survive without him for that long. It had to. And for reasons he couldn't fully explain, he suspected that watching Benjamin rebuild this barn might teach him something he desperately needed to learn about building a life worth living. The storm had come without warning on Tuesday night, a violent tempest that seemed to carry the fury of heaven itself. Benjamin remembered lying in his narrow bed, listening to the wind howl around his small farmhouse like a living thing seeking entry. The old structure had weathered many such storms, but this one felt different, angrier, more determined to remake the landscape according to its own wild design. The first crash had pulled him from restless sleep. Through his bedroom window, he'd watched in helpless horror as a massive oak tree, a giant that had stood sentinel over the community for more than a century, snapped like kindling and crashed into the barn's north wall. The second crash came moments later as the weakened structure began to fold in on itself. Century-old beams groaning and splintering under the assault of wind and rain died by morning. Miller's community barn was gone. The building had been more than timber and stone. It was the heart of their small community, the place where 3 generations had gathered for worship services too large for individual homes, where wedding receptions filled summer evenings with laughter and music, where children took their first tentative steps during Sunday fellowship dinners. The barn held memories like pressed flowers between pages of a beloved book, fragile, precious, irreplaceable dot standing among the wreckage that Wednesday morning. Benjamin had felt the weight of those memories settling on his shoulders. The twisted copper weather vane, a proud rooster that had crowned the barn's peak for 40 years, lay buried beneath splintered boards. Its neck bent, but its spirit somehow intact. He'd pulled it free and set it carefully aside, knowing that even broken things could find new purpose, if handled with reverence. The community meeting that evening had been held in the Stoltzfus family's kitchen, the largest available space now that their gathering place was gone. 12 families crowded around the oak table that Jonas Stoltzfus had crafted 20 years earlier, their voices mixing English and Pennsylvania Dutch as they discussed their options. "We should call Morrison Construction," suggested Isaac Fisher, a practical man in his 50s who managed the community's business dealings with the outside world. They built the new firehouse in town, modern materials, quick work. "We could have a new barn up in 2 weeks. 2 weeks? Martha Yoder shook her head. "In my day, a barn raising took 6 months of proper planning. Good things aren't rushed." "But Martha," Isaac's wife Anna interjected gently, "we have responsibilities. The Hostetter wedding is planned for August. Where will we hold it? And what?" about Sunday services when the weather turns cold. Benjamin had listened to the debate with growing unease. The younger families spoke of steel beams and concrete foundations, of hired crews and modern efficiency. They weren't wrong. Such methods would provide shelter quickly and cheaply, but something vital would be lost in the process. Some essential connection between the work of their hands and the home of their hearts. When the discussion turned to financing and contractors, Benjamin had quietly excused himself and walked home through the moonlit fields. The gentle night sounds, crickets chirping, owls calling. The distant lowing of cattle provided a stark contrast to the urgent voices he'd left behind. In his small kitchen, he'd made coffee and sat at his table until dawn, wrestling with a decision that felt much larger than rebuilding a single barn. By morning, his path was clear. "I'll rebuild it myself," he'd announced at Thursday evening's follow-up meeting. The kitchen fell silent, 12 faces turning toward him with expressions ranging from surprise to concern. "Benjamin," Isaac said carefully, "that's admirable. But impractical? You're 63 years old. This isn't like building a chicken coop or fixing a fence. We're talking about a 40-by-60-foot barn with a full loft and proper foundation. My great-grandfather was 65 when he helped raise the original barn," Benjamin replied quietly. "He used nothing but hand tools, draft horses, and good neighbors. The building stood for 99 years. How long will Morrison Construction's work last?" Young Daniel Miller, great-grandson of the man whose family named the barn, leaned forward eagerly. "I'll help you, Benjamin. I've been learning carpentry from my father." "And I," added Samuel Byler, whose newborn son would someday play in whatever barn they built. "My grandfather always said there's no teacher like honest work." But the practical concerns remained. Modern building codes would require permits, inspections, compliance with regulations that hadn't existed when the original barn was built. The project would take months, perhaps longer. What about the upcoming wedding? What about winter worship services? "We can't ask the community to wait that long," Anna Fisher said kindly but firmly. "We need to be realistic." Benjamin nodded, understanding their concerns without sharing them. "I'm not asking the community to wait. I'm asking for the freedom to begin." The meeting had ended with reluctant agreement to let Benjamin try, provided he accepted help from the younger men, and agreed to reconsider if the project proved too ambitious. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but allowed everyone to save face. Now, 3 days later, Benjamin stood alone in the morning light, the twisted weather vane in his hand serving as a tangible reminder of what had been lost, and what might yet be recovered. The copper was dented, but not cracked. The proud rooster's head bent downward, as if in prayer or grief. With careful pressure, Benjamin began working the metal back toward its original shape, feeling the copper respond to his gentle persistence. David Richardson's unexpected presence added a layer of complexity Benjamin hadn't anticipated. The Englishman had returned each morning for 3 days, parking his expensive car near the fence and observing the work with an intensity that suggested more than casual curiosity. He asked thoughtful questions, listened carefully to answers, and somehow managed to be helpful despite his obvious unfamiliarity with manual labor. This morning, David had arrived earlier than usual, carrying a thermos of coffee and wearing jeans instead of his business suit. The change in attire made him appear younger, more approachable, though the expensive watch and smartphone marked him as clearly as any uniform. "You're starting to straighten the weather vane," David observed, stepping carefully around the sorted piles of timber. "It's possible to fix most broken things if you're patient enough," Benjamin replied, working a particularly stubborn dent. "The copper remembers its original shape. It just needs gentle encouragement to return." David watched the careful process, noting how Benjamin never forced the metal, but instead worked with its natural properties, coaxing rather than commanding. "Is that your approach to rebuilding the barn as well?" in a way. The foundation stones. Remember what they're meant to support. The good timber remembers how it grew in the forest. My job isn't to impose my will on these materials, but to help them fulfill their intended purpose. It was a philosophy so foreign to David's experience that he struggled to process it. In his world, success meant bending reality to match his vision, forcing outcomes through willpower and resources. The idea of working with materials rather than against them, of patience as a tool rather than an obstacle, challenged everything he'd been taught about achievement. Benjamin set the partially repaired weather vane on his workbench and picked up a handsaw, its blade worn smooth by decades of use. He selected a damaged beam and began marking cut lines, measuring twice with a folding ruler that looked older than David. "Why are you really doing this alone?" David asked. The other night at the meeting, I could see people wanted to help. Benjamin paused in his measuring, considering the question. "When I was young, I thought strength meant carrying heavy burdens by yourself. As I've grown older, I've learned that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is choose your burdens carefully. This barn, rebuilding it the old way, with these hands and these tools, this is a burden I need to carry. But why?" The older man was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands resting on the beam. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of deep reflection. 5 years ago, when Ruth was dying, the doctors wanted to move her to a hospital in Philadelphia. Better equipment, they said. Specialists. Modern medicine that could extend her life by weeks or months. She asked me what I thought we should do. David waited, sensing this story held answers to questions he hadn't known how to ask. I told her we should stay home, that if her time was coming, she should spend it surrounded by things she loved, people who loved her in the place where we'd built our life together. The doctors said I was making an emotional decision, not a rational one. They were probably right. Benjamin picked up his saw and made the first careful cut, the blade moving smoothly through the aged oak. But Ruth died peacefully in our bed, holding my hand, with morning light streaming through the window onto her face. She was home. She was loved. She was ready. The saw's rhythm provided a gentle counterpoint to his words as he continued cutting. Sometimes the old ways aren't better because they're more efficient or cost-effective. Sometimes they're better because they honor something precious that gets lost when we choose convenience over meaning. David felt something shift in his chest as he watched Benjamin work. The older man's movements were economical, purposeful, rooted in traditions that stretched back generations. There was no waste, no hurry, no anxiety about productivity or deadlines. Just the quiet satisfaction of good work done well. For the first time in years, David found himself wondering what he was really building with his life, and whether any of it would matter when his own time came to an end. The weather vane, slowly returning to its original proud shape under Benjamin's patient care, seemed to be asking the same question of them both. The sound of David's phone had become a constant intrusion, its urgent buzzing cutting through the peaceful rhythm of Benjamin's work like a mechanical wasp seeking attention. By Thursday morning, David had taken to leaving it in his car, though. The knowledge of accumulating messages created a persistent ache in his chest that felt uncomfortably like withdrawal. Benjamin had begun the painstaking process of clearing the barn site, working methodically through the debris with the same careful attention he'd shown the weather vane. Each piece of wood was examined, sorted, and either set aside for reuse or stacked for kindling. Even the twisted nails weren't discarded. Benjamin collected them in a coffee can, explaining to David that they could be heated and straightened, their metal given new purpose. Nothing's truly waste unless you don't understand its potential, Benjamin said, holding up a bent nail that most people would have thrown away without thought. The iron was dark with age, but solid, forged by hand in an era when such work was done with patience rather than haste. David watched, fascinated, as Benjamin examined each nail with the care a jeweler might give to precious stones. These hand-forged pieces, some dating back to the barn's original construction, represented hours of work by long-dead craftsmen. To discard them would be to disrespect not just the materials, but the human effort they embodied. You really intend to straighten and reuse every single nail? Why wouldn't I? Benjamin replied, genuinely puzzled by the question. They're good iron, better than what you can buy today. These nails have held strong for nearly a century. Seems foolish to replace them with inferior materials just because it's easier. It was a philosophy that challenged everything David understood about efficiency and cost management. In his world, time was money, and money was the ultimate measure of value. The hours Benjamin would spend straightening old nails could buy hundreds of new ones. Yet, watching the older man work, David began to sense that some calculations couldn't be reduced to simple mathematics. Martha Yoder arrived mid-morning, as had become her custom, carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth that smelled of fresh bread and coffee. She moved with the efficient grace of a woman who'd managed a household and raised 7 children, her eyes bright with curiosity about the Englishman who'd been returning each day. "Mr. Richardson," she said, setting down her basket and studying. David, with motherly concern, "You're looking a bit peaked. When did you last have a proper meal?" David tried to remember. He'd grabbed coffee and a pastry at his hotel that morning, but actual meals had become increasingly irregular as he'd extended his stay in Lancaster County. His usual routine of business dinners and catered meetings seemed like memories from another life. "I'm fine, really. I don't want to impose nonsense." Martha was already unpacking her basket, revealing thick slices of homemade bread, a jar of strawberry preserves, and a thermos of coffee that smelled like heaven. "Benjamin, you haven't been eating enough either. Come sit for a few minutes." Benjamin protested that he had work to do, but Martha's expression brooked no argument. Soon both men found themselves sitting on upturned crates, sharing simple food that somehow tasted better than any meal David could remember. The bread was dense and nutty, still warm from the oven. The preserves were sweet with summer sunshine. Made from berries Martha had picked and canned herself. "You're staying at the inn in town?" Martha asked David between sips of coffee. Double quotes. "Yes, the Harvest Moon. It's quite charming." Martha nodded approvingly. "The Zimmermans run a good place. Clean rooms, honest prices. But eating restaurant food every day isn't healthy for a man your age. You need proper nutrition." David couldn't remember the last time anyone had worried about his nutrition. His ex-wife had given up such concerns years before their divorce, and his housekeeper in Manhattan maintained his refrigerator with the same efficiency she showed his laundry, functional but impersonal. "I've been meaning to ask," David said, turning to Benjamin. "Would you mind if I helped today? I know I'm not skilled, but I could move debris or sort materials under your direction." Benjamin studied him for a moment, perhaps assessing the sincerity of the offer. "The work is harder than it looks, and slower than you might expect. I have time. What about your business? Surely they need you back in New York." David felt the familiar tightness in his chest at the mention of his responsibilities. His assistant had left increasingly frantic voicemails. The Tokyo deal was hemorrhaging money. His board of directors was asking questions about his extended absence. Yet for the first time in his adult life, those urgent demands felt less important than the simple desire to be useful in this quiet place. "They'll manage without me for a while longer," Martha smiled knowingly. "Sometimes the Lord puts us exactly where we need to be, even when we don't understand why." Benjamin nodded slowly. "All right then, but we do things properly. No shortcuts, no hurrying. If you're going to help, you'll learn to do it right." For the next several hours, David discovered muscles he'd forgotten he possessed. Benjamin started him on simple tasks, carrying salvageable boards to designated piles, sorting hardware into containers, clearing smaller debris from the foundation stones. The work was methodical, requiring attention to detail that David found surprisingly engaging. Benjamin proved to be a patient teacher, never showing frustration when David asked questions or needed instruction repeated. He explained the difference between heartwood and sapwood, how to identify stress fractures that would weaken a board, why certain pieces of timber could be reused while others needed to be discarded. "This piece here," Benjamin said, indicating a beam that looked identical to a dozen others to David's untrained eye. "See how the grain runs? Those swirls mean the tree was fighting wind its whole life. That makes the wood stronger, more resilient. A perfectly straight grain looks prettier, but it breaks easier under stress." David found himself thinking about the metaphor as he worked. His own life had been remarkably straight-grain privileged childhood, elite education, steady climb up the corporate ladder. But maybe that apparent perfection had made him brittle rather than strong by afternoon. David's soft hands were developing blisters despite the work gloves Benjamin had provided. His back ached from bending and lifting. His expensive jeans were dirty with sawdust and soil. Yet he felt more alive than he had in months, more connected to something real and meaningful than any boardroom victory had ever made him feel. Benjamin noticed David's discomfort, but said nothing, allowing the younger man to discover his own limits. When David finally sat down heavily on a pile of lumber, breathing hard, Benjamin handed him a water jar without comment. "This is harder than I expected," David admitted. "Most things worth doing are. The question is whether you find meaning in the difficulty." David considered this as he watched Benjamin continue working with steady, unhurried movements. The older man had been at this since dawn, yet showed no signs of fatigue. His motions were economical, purposeful, rooted in decades of experience that had taught him how to work hard without wasting energy. "What makes this meaningful to you?" David asked. Benjamin paused, his hands resting on a piece of oak that would eventually become part of the new barn's frame. "Every beam that goes into this barn will outlive me, maybe outlive my great-grandchildren. When I shape a joint or place a stone, I'm not just building for today. I'm building for people who haven't been born yet, creating something that will shelter their celebrations and sorrows long after I'm dust." The weight of that perspective settled over David like a revelation. When had he last built something intended to outlast his own lifetime? His developments were designed for maximum return on investment, not longevity. His business deals were structured for quarterly profits, not generational impact. As the sun began its descent toward the western hills, David realized he was already planning to return tomorrow. His phone lay silent in his car, his urgent emails unanswered, his empire temporarily ungoverned. Yet for the first time in years, he felt he was exactly where he needed to be. The second week brought an unexpected rhythm to David's days. He would wake before dawn in his hotel room, make coffee with the small machine provided, and drive through the misty countryside to Benjamin's farm. The Amish man was always there. First, already at work by the time David arrived, moving with the quiet purposefulness that had first captured his attention. Benjamin's tool belt had become a source of fascination for David. The worn leather bore the patina of decades, shaped by its owner's body and work until it was as much a part of him as his weathered hands. Each tool had its designated place, its specific purpose, its accumulated history. The hammer's handle was smooth from use, the head dark with honest wear. The chisels were sharp as razors, their edges maintained with religious devotion. "My father gave me this belt when I turned 18, Benjamin explained, adjusting a plane that was older than David. His father had made it for him from leather they'd tanned themselves. Every tool has been earned, not bought." David found himself studying the belt's construction, noting how the leather pouches were positioned for maximum efficiency, how years of use had created a perfect fit between craftsman and equipment. In his world, tools were disposable computers replaced every few years. Phones upgraded annually. Even office furniture changed with fashion trends. But Benjamin's tools were heirlooms, each one maintained and respected, passed down like family treasures. The work itself demanded a different kind of thinking than David was accustomed to. In business, he thrived on speed and decisive action. Here, every cut had to be measured twice, every joint checked for precision. Mistakes couldn't be undone with delete keys or corrected in subsequent drafts. The wood would hold the memory of every error, every moment of impatience or inattention. "Watch the grain," Benjamin said, guiding David through his first attempt at using a handsaw. "Feel how it wants to be cut. Fighting the wood will dull your blade and waste your strength." David's initial cuts were ragged, uneven, marked by his tendency to force the tool rather than guide it. His muscles, accustomed to gym machines and ergonomic office furniture, protested the unfamiliar demands. Blisters formed on his palms despite the gloves, then broke and formed again, gradually becoming calluses. But something deeper was changing as well. The constant anxiety that had characterized his life for years, the perpetual sense of urgency, of fires needing to be fought and crises needing management, began to quiet. The rhythm of hand tools created space for thoughts he'd been too busy to think, feelings he'd been too driven to feel. Martha Yoder had taken it upon herself to ensure both men ate properly, appearing each morning with baskets of food that were as nourishing to the spirit as to the body. She seemed to understand that David was undergoing some kind of transformation, and she fed it with the same care she'd once shown her own children learning to walk. "You're looking better," she observed one morning, studying David's face as he gratefully accepted a still warm cinnamon roll. "Less like a man running from something he can't name." The comment stung with its accuracy. How long had he been running? From what? Exactly. The question haunted him as he worked alongside Benjamin, learning to read wood grain and respect the wisdom of hand tools. His phone calls to New York became increasingly difficult. His assistant, Patricia, had moved from concerned to barely concealed panic as deals stalled and meetings were postponed. The board of directors was asking pointed questions about his absence. Competitors were circling projects he'd previously controlled. "Mr. Richardson," Patricia said, during one particularly strained conversation, "the Yamamoto Group is threatening to pull out of the Tokyo deal entirely if you don't fly over this week. They're saying they can't do business with someone who's unreliable." David found himself looking at Benjamin, who was patiently teaching a young Amish boy how to drive a wooden peg into a mortise joint. The child, perhaps 8 years old, was struggling with the concept, his small hands barely able to grip the mallet properly. But Benjamin showed infinite patience, adjusting the boy's grip, steadying the peg, offering gentle encouragement. When frustration threatened, "Tell Yamamoto I'll call him tomorrow," David said finally, and canceled the board meeting. "Reschedule for next month." "Next month?" Patricia's voice rose an octave. "David, I don't think you understand the situation. Here, your empire is. My empire will survive a few weeks without my constant attention." David interrupted, surprising himself with his certainty. "If it can't, then it's not built on as solid a foundation as I thought." After hanging up, he found Benjamin watching him with understanding eyes. "Heavy burdens?" the older man asked. "Getting lighter," David replied, and meant it. The days took on a meditative quality that David had never experienced. There was something profoundly satisfying about working with his hands, creating something tangible and lasting from raw materials. Each morning brought new challenges, learning to cut proper joints, understanding how different woods behaved, developing the patience to work with rather than against the materials. Benjamin proved to be more than a skilled craftsman. He was a philosopher whose wisdom emerged through demonstration rather than lecture. He never preached about the value of simple living, but his entire approach to work embodied principles that challenged David's assumptions about success and fulfillment. "Why do you take so much time on details no one will ever see?" David asked. One afternoon, watching Benjamin carefully smooth the inside of a mortise joint with meticulous precision. "Who says no one will see it?" "Well, once the barn is finished, these joints will be covered by siding, hidden from view." Benjamin smiled, continuing his careful work. "Just because something can't be seen doesn't mean it doesn't matter. This joint will bear weight for decades, maybe centuries. Every time the barn settles or shifts with weather, this connection will be tested. If I do sloppy work here because it's hidden, the whole structure becomes weaker." He set down his chisel and looked directly at David. "Besides, I'll know it's there. Every time I walk past this barn, I'll know whether I honored the wood and the craft, or whether I cut corners because I thought nobody would notice." The lesson resonated far beyond carpentry. David thought of all the corners he'd cut in his business dealings, all the times he'd chosen expedience over excellence because he thought the compromises were invisible. But they weren't invisible to him. They accumulated like small weights in his chest, compromising the foundation of who he thought himself to be. That evening, as they cleaned their tools in the fading light, David made a decision that surprised him. Instead of returning to his hotel, he accepted Martha's long-standing invitation to join a family dinner at the Yoder household. The experience was like stepping into a forgotten world. The kitchen was warm with cooking smells and filled with the comfortable chaos of multiple generations sharing a meal. Children laughed, adults spoke in the musical cadences of Pennsylvania Dutch, and everyone helped with serving and cleaning without being asked. David found himself seated between Martha's grandson, a shy boy of 12, and her daughter-in-law, a woman his own age who treated him with the same warmth she showed family members. The food was simple, but perfect pot roast that fell apart at the touch of a fork, vegetables grown in their own garden, bread that made store-bought loaves. Seemed like cardboard, but it was the conversation that moved him most. No one talked about business or investments or market conditions. Instead, they shared stories about their day, asked after neighbors' health, planned community events with genuine enthusiasm. The pace was unhurried, the atmosphere peaceful, the connections between people evident in every interaction. As he drove back to his hotel that night, David realized he was experiencing something he'd lost without knowing it was gone. The simple pleasure of belonging somewhere, of being welcomed not for what he could provide, but for who he was in that moment. His reflection in the hotel mirror showed a man beginning to change. His expensive clothes were wrinkled and stained with honest dirt. His manicured hands bore calluses and small cuts from his inexperience with hand tools. His face had more color, fewer stress lines, a different kind of tiredness that came from physical work rather than mental pressure. For the first time in years, he looked like a man at peace with himself. 3 weeks into the project, Benjamin and David began working on what would become the barn's master beam, a massive piece of white oak that would anchor the entire structure. The timber was nearly 30 feet long and 18 inches square, hewn from a tree that had grown for over 2 centuries before being felled by the same storm that destroyed the barn. Finding purpose in destruction, beauty in loss, it was a lesson David was still learning to understand. The process of preparing the master beam required every skill Benjamin had developed over decades of woodworking. The surface had to be perfectly flat and square, the joints cut with precision that would determine the strength of the entire building. There was no room for error, no opportunity for correction once the cuts were made. "This beam will carry the weight of the entire loft," Benjamin explained, running his hands along the oak's length with the reverence of a blind man reading Braille. "Every board, every bale of hay, every celebration and gathering that happens in this barn will depend on this single piece of timber being properly prepared. David watched Benjamin work with growing appreciation for the complexity of traditional carpentry. Modern construction used standardized materials, uniform lumber cut by machines, to predetermined specifications. But working with hand-hewn timber meant adapting to the unique characteristics of each piece, understanding how it had grown, how it wanted to be shaped. The responsibility felt enormous. David had made million-dollar decisions with less consideration than Benjamin gave to each cut of his adze. The older man worked slowly, methodically, checking and rechecking every measurement, every angle, every surface. There was no clock driving the work, no deadline except the one imposed by winter weather still months away. "In my world," David said during a break, "time is always the enemy. Everything has to be done faster decisions, faster construction, faster profits. But watching you work, I'm starting to think maybe time is actually our ally if we know how to use it properly." The Benjamin smiled, wiping sweat from his forehead with a bandana that had seen decades of similar service. "Time is like this oak. You can force it to serve your purposes, but it works better when you partner with it instead of fighting it." That afternoon brought David's first real test of the patience Benjamin had been trying to teach. They were cutting the mortise joints that would connect the master beam to the vertical posts, work that required absolute precision. A mistake here would weaken the entire structure, potentially compromising the barn's integrity for generations. Benjamin guided David through marking the first joint, showing him how to use traditional tools, a mortise gauge to mark the exact width, a square to ensure perfect angles, a marking knife that cut rather than drew lines for maximum accuracy. Every step was checked and double-checked before proceeding to the next. "Now comes the real work," Benjamin said, handing David a mortise chisel. "Cut away everything that isn't supposed to be there, but don't cut away anything that is." The simple instruction contained layers of complexity that David was only beginning to appreciate. The wood had to be removed gradually, carefully, with constant attention to grain direction and cutting angles. Too aggressive, and the chisel would dive too deep or split the wood along unwanted lines. Too tentative, and progress would be impossibly slow. David's first attempts were disasters. He either cut too little, producing ragged surfaces that would never accept their matching tenons properly, or cut too much, creating joints that would be loose and unreliable. His hands cramped from gripping the unfamiliar tools. His back ached from bending over the work. Sweat dripped into his eyes despite the cool October air, but Benjamin never showed impatience. When David's frustration reached the breaking point, the older man would simply take the tools and demonstrate the proper technique once more, his movements economical and sure. Then he would hand the tools back to David and wait, prepared to repeat the lesson as many times as necessary. "Every craftsman has cut bad joints," Benjamin said, after David had mangled yet another attempt. "The wood teaches you, but only if you listen. Fighting it just makes the lesson take longer." As the afternoon wore on, something began to shift in David's approach. Instead of trying to impose his will on the oak, he started paying attention to what the wood was telling him. He learned to feel the grain direction through the chisel, to recognize when he was cutting with the wood versus against it. His movements became less forced, more flowing. When he finally cut a joint that met Benjamin's standard square, smooth, precisely sized, the satisfaction was unlike anything he'd experienced in business. This was success you could touch, accomplishment measured not in profit margins, but in the perfect fit of wood to wood. "Now you're beginning to understand," Benjamin said, examining the joint with approval. "The wood wants to be useful. Your job is to help it become what it's meant to be." That evening, as they cleaned their tools in the gathering dusk, Benjamin shared more of his personal story than he had before. His marriage to Ruth had been blessed in every way except one: children had never come. Despite years of hoping and praying, in a community where large families were the norm, their childless home had been a source of quiet sorrow. Ruth used to say that maybe we weren't meant to raise children, but to serve them, Benjamin reflected, carefully wiping down his chisels. She taught Sunday school for 30 years. I built cradles and toys and cribs for half the families in the county. We found our purpose in helping other people's children grow. David listened, understanding that Benjamin was sharing something precious and painful. His own relationship with his son, Michael, had been strained for years. Success in business had come at the cost of presence in his son's life. Soccer games missed for board meetings, school plays skipped for business trips, conversations postponed, until urgent deals were closed. Do you ever regret not having children of your own? David asked carefully. Benjamin considered the question for a long moment. Regret is too strong a word. I've learned that life doesn't always give us what we want, but it usually gives us what we need to become who we're meant to be. Ruth and I poured our parental love into the community's children. Maybe that was our calling all along. The words stung David with their implicit rebuke of his own choices. He had been blessed with a son, but had treated that gift with careless neglect, always promising himself there would be time later for the important conversations, the meaningful connections. Now, Michael was 17, preparing for college, essentially a stranger sharing his DNA. My son barely knows me, David admitted. I kept telling myself I was working for his future, building something to leave him. But what good is an inheritance if you don't have a relationship? Benjamin nodded with understanding born from observing many similar situations over the years. It's not too late. Building a relationship is like building anything else worthwhile. It takes time, patience, and the right foundation. But it can be done if both people are willing to do the work. As David drove back to his hotel that night, he found himself thinking about foundations, not just for barns, but for lives and relationships and legacies worth leaving. The master beam they'd worked on all day would support the barn for centuries, providing strength and stability for countless future gatherings. But what was supporting his own life? What legacy was he actually building through his choices and priorities? His phone had 17 missed calls and 43 unread messages. Evidence of an empire that demanded constant attention and feeding. But for the first time, those urgent demands felt less important than the solid satisfaction of a well-cut mortise joint and the growing. Understanding the true strength came not from forcing outcomes, but from patient partnership with materials and people that had their own wisdom to offer. The master beam would be ready tomorrow for its place in the barn's frame. David wondered if he would be ready for his own transformation, and whether the foundation of his life could support the weight of the man he was beginning to hope he might become. The art of joinery became David's obsession. Each wooden peg that Benjamin carved by hand was a small masterpiece, shaped to fit its specific hole with tolerance measured in thousandths of an inch. The pegs would hold the barn's massive timbers together without a single nail or screw, relying on the ancient principle of wood swelling and tightening when exposed to moisture, creating connections that grew stronger with time rather than weaker. Modern builders use metal fasteners because they're quick, but Benjamin explained, carefully shaping a peg with a draw knife that had belonged to his grandfather. But metal and wood expand and contract at different rates. Over time, the connection loosens. These wooden pegs will move with the timber, breathing with the barn through seasons and years. David found profound metaphor in the process. His own life had been held together with the equivalent of metal fasteners, rigid structures that couldn't adapt to changing circumstances. His marriage had failed partly because neither he nor his ex-wife had learned to grow together, to adjust and accommodate each other's evolution. Their relationship had been built on fixed expectations rather than flexible partnership. The work demanded complete presence. There was no multitasking with a draw knife. One moment of inattention could ruin hours of careful shaping or result in injury. David's phone remained in his car, its constant demands muted by distance and his growing realization that most urgent matters were simply loud rather than important. His hands had changed dramatically over the past month. The soft palms that had known only gym equipment and keyboard keys now bore honest calluses from hand tools. His grip had strengthened, his movements become more economical. He could feel wood grain through a tool handle, sense when a cut was going wrong before visual confirmation. Satisfaction. "You're beginning to think like a craftsman," he observed one morning, watching David select the proper chisel for a joint without being instructed. "Your hands are starting to know things your mind hasn't learned yet." The comment resonated deeply. David had spent his career living entirely in his head, analyzing markets and managing numbers and strategic planning that existed only on spreadsheets. But working with Benjamin was teaching him to trust other forms of intelligence, the wisdom in his hands, the knowledge that came through repetition and practice rather than theory. Their conversations during work had grown deeper, more personal. Benjamin shared stories from his marriage to Ruth, their quiet contentment with a life deliberately chosen over accidentally lived. David found himself confessing doubts and regrets he'd never acknowledged, even to himself. "I thought success meant accumulating things," David said one afternoon, carefully fitting a peg into a joint they'd spent hours perfecting. Money, properties, deals, recognition. But none of it feels real anymore. I could lose everything tomorrow, and I'm not sure anyone would miss the person I actually am, as opposed to what I represent. Benjamin nodded with understanding. Ruth used to say that the saddest people she knew were those who confused having with being. They'd collected so much stuff, they'd lost track of who they were underneath it all. The barn's frame was beginning to take shape, rising from the foundation stones with mathematical precision and organic beauty. Each joint was a small triumph, each beam placement a step towards something larger and more permanent than either man could create alone. The structure possessed an integrity that came from traditional methods, no shortcuts, no compromises, no hidden weaknesses that would reveal themselves under stress. David's business empire was experiencing stress of its own. His extended absence had created vacuum that competitors were eager to fill. The Tokyo deal had indeed collapsed, costing his company millions in projected revenue. His board of directors was scheduling emergency meetings to discuss his future as CEO. Patricia called with increasing desperation. "David, you have to come back. The board is talking about removing you from leadership. They're saying you've had some kind of breakdown, that you're not competent to run the company." "Maybe they're right," David replied, surprising himself with his calm acceptance of the possibility. "Maybe I'm not competent to run something I don't believe in anymore." "Don't believe in? You built this company from nothing. It's your life's work." David looked at the barn frame rising before him, each beam placed with intention and care, designed to serve purposes beyond profit shelter, community, celebration, continuity across generations. "No, Patricia, I built a money-making machine. There's a difference." The conversation ended with Patricia in tears and David strangely at peace. His net worth might be evaporating, his professional reputation crumbling, his future uncertain. But for the first time in decades, he felt aligned with his deepest values rather than fighting against them. That evening brought an unexpected visitor. Michael Richardson, David's 17-year-old son, arrived at the barn site in a borrowed car, his face a mixture of confusion and concern that made David's heart ache with recognition of how much he'd missed while building his empire. "Dad?" Michael approached cautiously, clearly uncertain of his welcome. "Mom said you were having some kind of crisis. She asked me to come talk to you." David set down his tools and really looked at his son, tall like himself, but lean in the way of teenagers, with dark hair that fell across thoughtful eyes. When had he grown so tall? When had the boy David remembered become this young man who was almost a stranger? Not a crisis, David said carefully. More like a awakening. Michael examined the barn frame with the analytical mind he'd inherited from his father. You're building this by hand? Learning to. Benjamin here is the real craftsman. I'm just the apprentice. Benjamin approached with his characteristic quiet dignity, extending his hand to Michael with genuine warmth. Your father has become a fine student. He's learning that good work takes time, but the time invested makes it valuable. For the next hour, Benjamin guided both father and son through examination of the joints they'd been crafting, explaining the principles of traditional joinery with the same patience he'd shown David. Michael proved to have inherited his father's quick intelligence, asking thoughtful questions about wood properties and structural engineering. It's like a puzzle, Michael observed, studying a mortise and tenon joint. But three-dimensional, and the pieces have to be perfect, or the whole thing fails. Exactly, Benjamin agreed. And unlike puzzles you buy in a store, this one will still be here when your grandchildren are grown, still serving its purpose, still bringing people together. David watched his son's face light up with understanding and felt something profound shift in his chest. This was what had been missing from their relationship: shared experience, common ground. The simple pleasure of learning something together without the pressure of performance or judgment. As the evening deepened, the three of them worked together to secure the day's progress, covering sensitive joints with tarps and organizing tools for tomorrow's work. Michael's presence transformed the dynamic, bringing out protective instincts in both older men and adding the energy that comes from youth encountering worthy challenges. Can I come back tomorrow? Michael asked as they prepared to leave. I mean, if I wouldn't be in the way. This is actually pretty cool. You'd be most welcome, Benjamin replied before David could answer. Good work is always better when it's shared. Driving back toward town with his son beside him, the first time they'd been alone together in months, David felt pieces of his life beginning to align in ways he'd never thought possible. The barn was rising, beam by beam, joint by joint, into something beautiful and lasting. Maybe relationships could be rebuilt the same way, with patience and proper foundations and the understanding that the most important work couldn't be rushed. The revelation came by accident, as the most profound truths often do. David was helping Benjamin organize tools at the end of another long day when a photograph fell from the older man's coat pocket, a black and white image, creased and faded with age. David picked it up to hand it back, then stopped, staring at the image with growing recognition. The photograph showed a young man in his 20s, wearing work clothes and a hard hat, standing in front of a partially constructed skyscraper. The face was unmistakably Benjamin's, though decades younger, with the same thoughtful eyes and strong jaw. But it was the background that made David's breath catch. He recognized the distinctive architecture of downtown Philadelphia, and more specifically, a building that had become central to his own family's history. Benjamin, David said slowly, holding up the photograph. Where was this taken? Benjamin's face went still as he recognized what David was holding. For a long moment, the two men looked at each other across a silence heavy with implications. Neither had anticipated. Philadelphia, Benjamin said quietly. Spring of 1982. I was 24 years old. The Meridian Tower project? Benjamin nodded, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he took back the photograph. I worked construction for Richardson Industries for 3 years. Your father's company, though I didn't know you then. You would have been, what, 6 years old? The world seemed to tilt around David as pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed suddenly clicked into place. Richardson Industries, the construction company his father had built from nothing. The foundation of the Richardson family fortune had been sold when David was 12. His father had transitioned into development, leaving behind the hands-on construction work that had made him wealthy, but nearly killed him with stress and 12-hour days. "You knew my father," David said, the words barely above a whisper. "James Richardson was a good man, but a driven one," Benjamin replied, settling heavily onto a sawhorse. He treated his workers fairly, paid above union wages, took pride in building things that would last. But the pressure was eating him alive. I remember thinking he looked older every month, like the weight of all those projects was physically crushing him. David's mind raced through implications he was only beginning to understand. What happened? Why did you leave construction? Benjamin's eyes grew distant, focused on memories that clearly still carried pain. There was an accident. July 15th, 1982. We were working on the 32nd floor of the Meridian Tower. A crane operator had been drinking. We found out later he'd been battling alcoholism for years, but nobody reported it because jobs were scarce and he had a family to feed. The older man's voice grew quieter, more strained. The crane was lifting a steel beam into position when the operator passed out. The beam swung wild, caught 3 workers on the edge of the platform. 2 of them fell. 32 floors down. David felt ice forming in his stomach. He knew this story. It was part of his family's history, one of the reasons his father had eventually left construction. But he'd only heard it from the corporate perspective. The lawsuits and insurance claims and regulatory investigations that had nearly bankrupted Richardson Industries. One of those men had a family, Benjamin continued. Wife, 2 small children. He was saving money to buy a house, working double shifts to get ahead. Good man. Careful worker. The other was just 19, fresh out of high school, full of dreams about what he was going to do with his life. You knew them. Thomas Miller was my friend. We'd worked together for 2 years, shared lunch breaks, talked about our hopes for the future. The 19-year-old was Danny Hoffman. I'd been teaching him carpentry skills, showing him how to read blueprints properly. He reminded me of myself when I was starting out, eager, respectful, wanting to learn everything. Benjamin pulled out a handkerchief and carefully cleaned the photograph, his movements slow and reverent. I was supposed to be on that platform with them. Would have been, except your father had asked me to work on interior details that day. Finish carpentry in the executive offices. If not for that assignment change, I would have fallen too. The weight of revelation settled on David like a physical burden. His family's wealth had been built, in part, on projects where men had died doing dangerous work. Men with families, dreams, futures that were cut short because safety had been sacrificed for speed and profit. The investigation took months, Benjamin continued. Your father was devastated. I remember him at the memorial service, tears streaming down his face, promising the families that he would make changes, improve safety protocols, ensure nothing like that ever happened again. And he did make changes. But for me, the damage was done. You blamed him for what happened. Benjamin shook his head slowly. Not blamed, exactly. Your father wasn't responsible for that crane operator's drinking, wasn't directly responsible for the deaths. But the whole system, the pressure to finish fast, to keep costs down, to prioritize profit margins over everything else, that system had created conditions where accidents became inevitable. David thought about his own business practices, the relentless focus on quarterly returns, the way human costs were reduced to abstract numbers in spreadsheets. How many corners had he cut? How many risks had he accepted as reasonable because the alternative would reduce profits? After the funerals, I couldn't go back to construction, Benjamin said. Every time I looked at a high-rise, every time I heard construction equipment, I saw Thomas and Danny falling. I started having nightmares, panic attacks. I was 24 years old and felt like I was carrying the weight of the world. So you came here, eventually. First, I tried drinking my way through the grief. Then I tried moving to different cities, different jobs, thinking I could outrun the memories. Nothing worked. I was lost, angry at God, angry at the world, angry at myself for surviving when better men had died. Benjamin stood and walked to where the barn's frame rose against the evening sky. I ended up here by accident. Car broke down on a back road during a snowstorm. An Amish family, the Millers, Thomas's distant cousins, though I didn't know that then, took me in, fed me, helped me fix my car. I intended to leave as soon as the roads cleared. But you stayed. 3 days became a week became a month. These people lived so differently from anything I'd known. They worked with their hands, but the work had meaning beyond money. They built things to last generations, not just to meet building codes. They took care of each other, shared burdens, found purpose in service rather than success. David watched Benjamin's face as he spoke, seeing the peace that had replaced whatever torment had driven him to seek refuge among the Amish. But he also something else, a kinship he was only beginning to understand. You were running from the same world I've been living in, David said. Different decade, same fundamental problems. The relentless pressure, the way everything gets reduced to numbers, the distance between the people making decisions and the people living with the consequences. Benjamin turned to face David directly. When I first saw you watching me work, I recognized something familiar. The same restlessness I'd carried for years. The same sense of being trapped in a life that looked successful from the outside but felt empty inside. The implications crashed over David in waves. He and Benjamin weren't just unlikely friends. They were connected by history, by tragedy, by the same system that had wounded them both in different ways. His father's company had taken 2 lives and driven Benjamin into exile. His own company was built on the same foundational principles that had created those conditions. Does the community know about your past? Some do. I've never hidden it exactly, but I don't talk about it often. The past is past. What matters is who we choose to become with the wisdom our experiences have given us. As night fell around them, David found himself looking at the barn frame with new eyes. This structure wasn't just Benjamin's way of serving his community. It was his answer to the Meridian Tower, his alternative to the system that had claimed his friends' lives. Every joint cut with patience rather than haste. Every decision made with permanence rather than profit in mind. Every day spent working at human pace rather than machine speed. Is this why you're rebuilding the barn alone? Some kind of penance? Benjamin considered the question carefully. Not penance. Redemption, maybe. Or simply the choice to build something that honors what I learned from those deaths rather than running from them. Thomas and Danny died because we were all in too much hurry, cutting too many corners, accepting too many risks. This barn is being built the opposite way, with time, with care, with respect for everyone who will be touched by the work. David felt tears he hadn't shed in years gathering in his eyes. His success, his empire, his entire identity was built on the same foundation that had destroyed Benjamin's first life and claimed 2 innocent men. The man who had become his teacher, his guide towards something better, was connected to his family's history in ways that seemed too profound for coincidence. What do I do with this? David asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. Benjamin placed a weathered hand on David's shoulder. The same thing I did. You acknowledge the past without being imprisoned by it. You choose to learn from the pain rather than run from it. And you decide who you want to become with the time you have left. The barn stood before them, half completed, but already beautiful in its proportions and integrity. Tomorrow they would continue the work. David, Benjamin, and now Michael. 3 generations, connected by craft and purpose, rather than profit and pressure. The structure would rise slowly, properly, built to last for centuries rather than quarters. It was a different kind of legacy than David had ever imagined building. But looking at Benjamin's peaceful face in the moonlight, he began to understand it might be the only kind that truly mattered. The bronze bell had been Martha Yoder's idea, suggested during one of her morning visits as she watched the barn frame take its final shape against the October sky. "Every proper barn needs a bell to call the community together," she'd said, her eyes twinkling with the satisfaction of someone who understood both tradition and necessity. Benjamin had crafted the bell mounting himself, carving the wooden yoke from seasoned maple with the same meticulous attention he'd shown every other aspect of the project. The bell itself, donated by the community from the old schoolhouse that had been demolished 5 years earlier, would serve both practical and symbolic purposes. It would call families to worship services, announce celebrations and emergencies, and remind everyone within its reach that they belonged to something larger than themselves. David found profound meaning in the bell's intended purpose. For months, he'd been learning to answer different kinds of calls, not the urgent demands of profit and productivity, but the quieter summons of craft and community and connection. The transformation hadn't been easy or comfortable, but it had been necessary in ways he was still discovering. His business empire was indeed collapsing, though not as catastrophically as he'd feared. Patricia had negotiated a buyout with his board of directors that would preserve most employees' jobs while removing David from leadership. The financial loss was significant, but not devastating. He would emerge from the transition wealthy enough to live comfortably for the rest of his life, though not wealthy enough to maintain the lifestyle he'd previously considered normal. "Are you sure about this?" Patricia had asked during their final business call, her voice heavy with concern for the man who'd been both boss and friend for 8 years. "You could fight the board's decision, get investors to back you, start over with a new company. You're only 46, you had decades of productive years ahead of you." "I'm planning to be productive," David had replied, watching Benjamin carefully adjust the bell's mounting hardware, just in a different way than before. The conversation with Michael had been even more significant. His son had been visiting the barn site regularly since his first appearance, drawn by the same satisfaction David had discovered in honest work done well. The boy showed natural aptitude for carpentry, and more importantly, he seemed to find in the traditional craft something his generation rarely experienced: patience rewarded, quality valued over speed, connection between hand and mind and heart. "I've been thinking about college differently," Michael had confided one afternoon as they worked together to sand a beam to silky smoothness. "All my friends are planning to study business or computer science or finance, things that will make them money fast. But watching you and Benjamin work, seeing how much satisfaction you get from building something that will last, maybe there are other ways to measure success." David's throat had tightened with emotion at his son's words. Here was the legacy he'd never known he wanted to leave, not a business empire built on quarterly profits, but a young man who understood that meaningful work mattered more than lucrative work. The community had initially been skeptical of the traditional barn raising Benjamin had proposed for the final construction phase. Modern construction happened differently, crews of specialists working in sequence, each group completing their assigned tasks before moving on to the next project. But Benjamin had convinced them that the old ways offered something valuable beyond mere efficiency: the satisfaction of collective accomplishment, the strengthening of community bonds, the passing down of knowledge from generation to generation. When my great-grandfather helped raise the original barn, Benjamin had explained to the gathered families, it wasn't just about putting up a building. It was about declaring that this community would endure, that we were committed to each other's success, that we could accomplish together what none of us could manage alone. The date had been set for the first Saturday in November, weather permitting. Families had been making preparations for weeks, organizing tools and materials, planning the massive communal meal that would follow the work, arranging childcare. For the youngest ones who were too small to help, but too young to be left at home. David's role in the barn raising had been a subject of delicate negotiation within the community. He was clearly not Amish, despite his growing skills and evident commitment to the project. Some families wondered whether it was appropriate for an outsider to participate in such a traditional gathering. Others argued that his contributions to the barn's construction had earned him a place in its completion. The question had been resolved by Benjamin himself, who addressed the community with characteristic quiet authority. David Richardson has worked alongside me for 2 months. He's learned our methods, respected our pace, and contributed his sweat to every beam that's been shaped. More importantly, he's shown that a man can change, can choose different values than the ones he was raised with. If that's not worthy of our welcome, then we've forgotten what our own faith teaches about redemption and second chances. The speech had been unlike any David had ever heard in a boardroom or conference hall. No charts or statistics, no competitive analysis or strategic positioning. Just simple truth spoken by a man whose life demonstrated the principles he advocated. As the barn raising approached, David found himself experiencing anticipation unlike anything he'd felt since childhood Christmas mornings. But underneath the excitement lay deeper currents of anxiety and determination. This day would test everything he'd learned about patience, craftsmanship, and community. More than that, it would demonstrate whether his transformation was real or merely superficial, whether he could truly work as part of a team rather than leading it, contribute to something larger than himself without needing to control its direction. Michael's presence would make the day even more meaningful. Father and son working together, learning together, building something that would outlast both their lifetimes. When had they last shared an experience of such significance? When had David last felt proud of the example he was setting for his child? The weather forecast called for clear skies and mild temperatures, perfect conditions for the heavy physical work that lay ahead. 23 families had committed to participating, bringing tools and skills passed down through generations. The oldest participant would be Ezra Stoltzfus, age 78, who had helped raise more barns than anyone could count. The youngest would be 6-year-old Emma Yoder, who had been practicing with a toy hammer for weeks in preparation for her first barn raising. Benjamin had spent the final days before the event in careful preparation, organizing materials with military precision, checking and rechecking measurements, ensuring that every piece was ready for its intended purpose. There would be no time for corrections once the raising began. Timber frames had to be assembled quickly, while enough strong backs were available to lift the massive sections into place. "Are you ready for this?" Benjamin asked David on the evening before the barn raising, as they stood together surveying the carefully arranged piles of numbered beams and joists. David considered the question seriously. Was he ready to work alongside people whose trust he was still earning? Ready to follow rather than lead? Contribute rather than control? Ready to be judged not by his bank account or business reputation, but by his willingness to strain his back and risk his safety for the common good. "I'm terrified," he admitted. "What if I make a mistake? What if I slow everyone down? What if I prove I don't really belong here?" Benjamin smiled with understanding, born from his own experience of leaving one world for another. "Those are exactly the right fears to have. They'll keep you humble, attentive, focused on serving rather than being served. Men who aren't afraid of making mistakes usually make the biggest ones." That night, David lay awake in his hotel room, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the morning ahead. His hands were no longer soft. Months of hand tool work had left them scarred and calloused and strong. His body was leaner, harder, more capable than it had been in decades. His mind was clearer, more focused, less cluttered with the anxious noise that had characterized his thinking for years. But the deepest changes weren't physical or even mental, they were spiritual. though he would have been uncomfortable using that word to describe them. He felt connected to something larger than himself in ways he'd never experienced during his business success. The barn rising tomorrow would be more than construction work. It would be an act of faith, community, continuity across generations. As dawn approached, David found himself praying for the first time since childhood, not for success or profit or personal advantage, but for strength to be worthy of the trust that had been placed in him, wisdom to contribute meaningfully to the common effort, and grace to become the kind of man his son could respect and his community could value. The bell would ring at sunrise, calling everyone to begin the most important day's work of David's life. Everything he'd learned about patience, craftsmanship, and community would be tested in the hours ahead. But for the first time in years, he felt ready for whatever challenges awaited, not because he was confident of success, but because he understood that the attempt itself was what mattered most. The raising rope was 2 inches thick and strong as ship's rigging, woven from hemp fibers that had aged to the color of honey. Benjamin had checked every foot of its length the night before, running his hands along the twisted strands to feel for worn spots or weak points that might fail under the enormous stress of lifting timber frames in the place. Dawn broke clear and cold, the October air sharp with the promise of winter still weeks away. David arrived at the barn site before sunrise, his breath visible in small puffs as he helped Benjamin make final preparations. The foundation looked different in the early light, more purposeful, more ready to receive the structure that would complete its reason for existence. By 7 o'clock, buggies began arriving in steady procession, their steel-rimmed wheels crunching on gravel as families brought their tools, their skills, and their commitment to the day's work. David watched with growing amazement as the barn site transformed into something resembling a medieval guild, gathering master craftsmen, directing apprentices, experienced hands guiding newcomers, 3 generations working together with shared purpose. Michael arrived with Martha Yoder, riding in her grandson's buggy and carrying a canvas tool bag that Benjamin had given him the previous week. The boy's excitement was barely contained, his energy infectious as he moved among the gathering workers with teenage enthusiasm tempered by respect for the magnitude of the task ahead. "This is actually happening," Michael said to his father, his voice filled with wonder at the sight of so many people gathered for a single purpose. "It is indeed," David replied, feeling his own excitement building as he watched Benjamin organize the workers into teams based on experience and physical capability. The older man moved with quiet authority, his knowledge of both construction techniques and human nature evident in every assignment he made. The first frame to be raised would be the south wall, 40 feet of interconnected beams and braces. That had been pre-assembled on the ground over the past week. 8 men took positions along the frame's length, their hands gripping the raising rope that had been threaded through pulleys mounted on temporary posts. The physics were simple but demanding. Human muscle would lift several thousand pounds of oak timber from horizontal to vertical, then hold it steady while permanent braces were installed. "Remember," Benjamin called out as the teams took their positions, "this is not about speed. It's about safety and precision. We lift together, we move together, we think together. No one tries to be a hero." David found himself positioned between Isaac Fisher, a man in his 50s who had participated in dozens of barn raisings, and young Daniel Miller, whose 19-year-old strength was evident in his eagerness to pull harder than necessary. The raising rope felt alive in David's hands, vibrating with tension as the other men took up their positions. "Ready?" Benjamin called out. 8 voices responded in unison. "Ready. Lift." The frame seemed impossibly heavy at first, the rope stretching under load as 8 men coordinated their effort to overcome gravity and inertia. David's back muscles screamed in protest as he pulled with everything he had, his feet planted wide for stability, his hands burning despite the work gloves Benjamin had insisted everyone wear. Slowly, incredibly, the massive frame began to rise, Inch by inch, foot by foot, the horizontal assembly rotated toward vertical, the raising rope creaking under tension as pulleys redirected the force of human effort into mechanical advantage. David found himself holding his breath, afraid that any distraction might disrupt the delicate balance of forces that was lifting thousands of pounds of timber against the pull of the earth. "Steady now," Benjamin called as the frame approached. The critical halfway point where physics would shift from enemy to ally. "Keep it controlled. Don't let it run away from us." The moment of transition was magical. 1 second, the men were straining against dead weight that seemed to want nothing more than to crash back to the ground. The next second, momentum shifted, and the frame wanted to continue rising, requiring restraint rather than force to control its movement toward vertical. Michael stood with the other young men assigned to ground support, ready with temporary braces that would hold the frame steady. Once it reached its final position, his face was tense with concentration, understanding that his father's safety, everyone's safety, depended on each person performing their assigned role correctly. As the frame settled into position with a satisfying thud that resonated through the foundation stones, a cheer went up from the gathered community. David felt tears prick his eyes at the simple joy on the faces around him, satisfaction earned through honest effort, success measured in structural integrity rather than profit margins. But this was only the beginning. 3 more walls waited to be raised, each one presenting its own challenges and requiring its own coordination of human effort. The south wall now stood proud against the morning sky, its joints tight and true, its timbers aligned with the precision that only traditional craftsmanship could achieve. Benjamin walked along the completed wall, checking connections and adjusting braces with the practiced eye of someone who understood that perfection at this stage would prevent problems for generations to come. His approval, when it came, was expressed through a simple nod and the beginning preparations for raising the west wall. David flexed his hands, already sore from the morning's effort, and prepared himself for the long day ahead. The raising rope awaited the next frame, the next test of coordination and strength, the next step toward completing something that would outlast everyone who labored to create it. By late afternoon, 3 walls stood strong against the autumn sky, their oak timbers golden in the slanting light. The barn had transformed from scattered materials into something recognizable, a structure with purpose, proportion, and the kind of beauty that came from function, perfected through centuries of refinement. But the most challenging work still lay ahead. The final shingle was more than just the last piece of the roof. It was the moment when individual effort would become collective legacy. Benjamin had carved it himself from cedar, smooth as silk, and fitted with the precision that characterized every aspect of the barn's construction. When it was installed, the building would be complete, ready to serve the community for generations to come. David stood with Michael on the barn's newly completed loft floor, both father and son awed by the view from this elevated perspective. The rolling Pennsylvania countryside stretched in all directions, painted in the warm colors of late October. From here, they could see other farms, other barns, other examples of the continuity that connected past to future through the simple act of building something worthy of preservation. "It's beautiful up here," Michael said, his voice filled with wonder at both the vista and their role in creating it. "It is," David agreed, though he was thinking less about the landscape than about the journey that had brought them to this moment. 6 months ago, he couldn't have imagined standing in a hand-built barn with his son, both of them dirty and tired from honest work, both of them proud of something they'd helped create with their own hands. Benjamin climbed the ladder to join them, carrying the final shingle and the simple ceremony that would mark its installation. The entire community had gathered below, their upturned faces reflecting the satisfaction of work well done and purpose fulfilled. Even the smallest children seemed to understand they were witnessing something significant. "This shingle completes the barn," Benjamin said, holding up the piece of cedar that looked so ordinary, yet carried such symbolic weight. But more than that, it completes a promise. We promised each other that we would rebuild what the storm destroyed. We promised to do it properly, with respect for tradition and commitment to permanence. We promised to work together rather than apart. He handed the shingle to David, whose eyes widened with surprise and emotion. This should be done by someone from the community, someone who belongs here. You do belong here, Benjamin replied simply. You've earned your place through honest work and genuine commitment. Your hands have shaped every beam in this structure. Your sweat is mixed with ours in the mortise and tenon joints that will hold this barn together. Who is more right to place the final piece? David felt the weight of the community's trust as he accepted the shingle. Below, faces looked up at him with acceptance rather than judgment, with gratitude rather than suspicion. These people had welcomed an outsider, taught him their methods, allowed him to contribute to something precious to them. The responsibility felt enormous and humbling. Michael positioned himself to help steady the shingle as David carefully aligned it with the precise gap Benjamin had left for it. The piece fit perfectly, its edges matching the surrounding shingles with the tolerance. That came from traditional craftsmanship rather than machine precision. Father and son worked together to secure it in place, their movements synchronized by months of learning to work with patience rather than haste as the final nail was driven home. A cheer rose from the gathered community, not the manufactured enthusiasm of business celebrations, but the genuine joy that came from shared accomplishment. Children clapped, adults smiled with satisfaction, and elders nodded with approval at work that honored their traditions while serving future generations. Barn raising was complete, but the day's meaning extended far beyond construction. David found himself surrounded by families who had accepted him despite his different background, his awkward beginnings, his obvious unfamiliarity with their way of life. He had contributed to something lasting, something valuable, something that would serve purposes beyond profit for decades to come. Martha Yoder had prepared a feast that transformed the afternoon into celebration. Tables appeared as if by magic, loaded with dishes that represented the best of each family's contributions. David sat with Michael among people who had become friends rather than mere acquaintances, sharing food and stories and the quiet satisfaction that came from meaningful work completed. What happens now? Michael asked as the celebration began to wind down, families starting to gather their children and tools for the journey home. David looked at the completed barn, its bronze bell catching the last light of the setting sun, and realized he knew the answer with surprising certainty. Now we figure out what else needs building. Benjamin overheard the comment and smiled with understanding. There's always something that needs building, he said. Barns, houses, relationships, communities, lives worth living. The question is whether you're willing to do the work properly. David looked at his son, at the man who had become his teacher, at the community that had become his second family. His old life lay in ruins, but something better had been constructed in its place, not quickly or easily, but with the kind of patience and precision that created things designed to last. The final shingle was in place, but David understood that his real construction project was just beginning, building a life worth living, one careful choice at a time. 6 months later, the spring sun warmed the newly carved sign that marked the entrance to Miller's community barn. The wooden placard bore 2 names etched with careful precision. Built by Benjamin Weaver and David Richardson, 2024. David had insisted on the shared credit, though Benjamin had protested that the older man's contribution far exceeded his own. The compromise reflected something deeper than attribution. It represented a partnership that had transformed both their lives in ways neither had anticipated. David's transformation from Manhattan's CEO to rural craftsman hadn't been seamless, but it had been complete. He'd purchased a modest farmhouse 3 miles from Benjamin's property, close enough for daily collaboration, but far enough to maintain the independence both men valued. The house came with 20 acres of pasture and woodland, space enough for the workshop David was building and the garden. Michael had insisted they plant together. The workshop was taking shape slowly, constructed with the same deliberate patience Benjamin had taught him during the barn project. Every joint was hand-cut, every beam carefully selected, every detail crafted with the understanding that good work couldn't be rushed. David had discovered that building with his own hands provided satisfactions his business success had never offered. The tactile pleasure of working with natural materials, the visible progress of each day's effort, the permanent nature of achievements that would outlast their creator. Michael had deferred college for a year to work alongside his father, ostensibly to figure out what he really wanted to study. But David suspected his son was learning things no university could teach: the satisfaction of meaningful work, the value of patience over speed, the deep contentment that came from contributing to something larger than oneself. Their relationship had blossomed in ways that years of forced father-son activities had never achieved. Shared labor created natural opportunities for conversation, problems to solve together, quiet moments where important truths could be spoken without the artificial pressure of planned bonding time. "I've been thinking about studying sustainable architecture," Michael had mentioned one morning as they worked together to install windows in the workshop. Combining traditional building methods with modern environmental consciousness. Buildings that last centuries instead of decades. David had felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with ambition and everything to do with recognizing his son's thoughtful approach to choosing a life path. "That sounds like work that would matter," he'd replied, and meant it completely. Benjamin's role in David's transformation had evolved from teacher to partner to something approaching family. The older man still maintained his quiet independence, still lived simply in his small farmhouse, still rose before dawn to begin each day with meditation and prayer. But he seemed lighter somehow, less burdened by the solitary nature of his existence. Having someone to share his knowledge with, to pass down skills to, had given him a sense of legacy he thought lost when he and Ruth remained childless. The barn itself had become exactly what Benjamin had envisioned: a gathering place that served multiple purposes for the community. Sunday worship services filled it with voices raised in traditional hymns. Wedding receptions brought young couples to dance their first steps as husband and wife under its hand-hewn beams. Children played hide-and-seek among the hay bales stored in its loft, their laughter echoing off walls that would shelter their own children's games someday. But perhaps most importantly, the barn had become a symbol of what was possible when people chose cooperation over competition, patience over speed, permanence over profit. Word of the project had spread beyond the immediate Amish community, attracting visitors who came to see a building constructed entirely by hand in an age of machine production. David had been surprised by his own reaction to these visitors. Instead of seeing them as potential customers or business opportunities, he found himself viewing them as students in need of the same lessons he'd learned. Some were burned-out executives like his former self, seeking alternatives to the relentless pressure of corporate success. Others were young people disillusioned with career paths that seemed to offer wealth but not meaning. A few had stayed longer than initially planned, drawn by the same qualities that had captivated David: the rhythm of hand tool work, the satisfaction of visible progress, the community of people who measured success by different standards. They'd formed an informal apprenticeship program with Benjamin and David, teaching traditional carpentry skills to anyone willing to learn with proper patience and respect. Martha Yoder had dubbed them Martha's Strays, though her tone carried affection rather than criticism. "The Lord keeps sending us people who need to remember what really matters," she'd observed, watching a former investment banker learn to plane a board smooth with hand tools. "Good thing we have space for them." The bronze bell that crowned the barn was rung each evening at sunset. its clear tone carrying across the countryside as a reminder that another day of honest work was complete. David had come to cherish that sound, the way it marked time not by productivity or profit, but by the simple completion of tasks worth doing. It was a different rhythm than the relentless urgency that had characterized his former life, and he discovered he preferred it completely. His relationship with his ex-wife had improved as well, though she remained baffled by his transformation. "I don't understand what you found in that place," she'd said during one of their increasingly civil conversations, "but you seem happier than I've seen you in years. And Michael clearly loves working with you." The observation was accurate. David had found something in Benjamin's world that his previous success had never provided. A sense of purpose that extended beyond personal achievement. Work that served others rather than just accumulating wealth, connections to people, and place that would endure beyond his own lifetime. As he stood in the completed barn on this warm spring evening, watching Michael help Benjamin organize tools after another day's work, David reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The storm that destroyed the original barn had seemed like simple destruction, a random act of nature requiring reconstruction. But he understood now that some destruction cleared the way for something better, not just new buildings, but new ways of living, new definitions of success, new understanding of what it meant to build a life worth living. 6 months later, the spring sun warmed the newly carved sign that marked the entrance to Miller's community barn. The wooden placard bore 2 names etched with careful precision, built by Benjamin Weaver and David Richardson, 2024. David had insisted on the shared credit, though Benjamin had protested that the older man's contribution far exceeded his own. The compromise reflected something deeper than attribution. It represented a partnership that had transformed both their lives in ways neither had anticipated. David's transformation from Manhattan's CEO to rural craftsman hadn't been seamless, but it had been complete. He'd purchased a modest farmhouse 3 miles from Benjamin's property, close enough for daily collaboration, but far enough to maintain the independence both men valued. The house came with 20 acres of pasture and woodland, space enough for the workshop David was building and the garden Michael had insisted they plant together. The workshop was taking shape slowly, constructed with the same deliberate patience Benjamin had taught him during the barn project. Every joint was hand-cut, every beam carefully selected, every detail crafted with the understanding that good work couldn't be rushed. David had discovered that building with his own hands provided satisfactions his business success had never offered. The tactile pleasure of working with natural materials, the visible progress of each day's effort, the permanent nature of achievements that would outlast their creator. Michael had deferred college for a year to work alongside his father, ostensibly to figure out what he really wanted to study. But David suspected his son was learning things no university could teach: the satisfaction of meaningful work, the value of patience over speed, the deep contentment that came from contributing to something larger than oneself. Their relationship had blossomed in ways that years of forced father-son activities had never achieved. Shared labor created natural opportunities for conversation, problems to solve together, quiet moments where important truths could be spoken without the artificial pressure of planned bonding time. "I've been thinking about studying sustainable architecture," Michael had mentioned one morning as they worked together to install windows in the workshop, combining traditional building methods with modern environmental consciousness. Buildings that last centuries instead of decades. David had felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with ambition and everything to do with recognizing his son's thoughtful approach to choosing a life path. "That sounds like work that would matter," he replied, and meant it completely. Benjamin's role in David's transformation had evolved from teacher to partner to something approaching family. The older man still maintained his quiet independence, still lived simply in his small farmhouse, still rose before dawn to begin each day with meditation, and prayer. But he seemed lighter somehow, less burdened by the solitary nature of his existence. Having someone to share his knowledge with, to pass down skills to, had given him a sense of legacy he'd thought lost when he and Ruth remained childless. The barn itself had become exactly what Benjamin had envisioned, a gathering place that served multiple purposes for the community. Sunday worship services filled it with voices raised in traditional hymns. Wedding receptions brought young couples to dance their first steps as husband and wife under its hand-hewn beams. Children played hide-and-seek among the hay bales stored in its loft, their laughter echoing off walls that would shelter their own children's games someday. But perhaps most importantly, the barn had become a symbol of what was possible when people chose cooperation over competition, patience over speed, permanence over profit. Word of the project had spread beyond the immediate Amish community, attracting visitors who came to see a building constructed entirely by hand in an age of machine production. David had been surprised by his own reaction to these visitors. Instead of seeing them as potential customers or business opportunities, he found himself viewing them as students in need of the same lessons he'd learned. Some were burned-out executives like his former self, seeking alternatives to the relentless pressure of corporate success. Others were young people disillusioned with career paths that seemed to offer wealth but not meaning. A few had stayed longer than initially planned, drawn by the same qualities that had captivated David: the rhythm of hand tool work, the satisfaction of visible progress, the community of people who measured success by different standards. They'd formed an informal apprenticeship program with Benjamin and David, teaching traditional carpentry skills to anyone willing to learn with proper patience and respect. Martha Yoder had dubbed them Martha's Strays, though her tone carried affection rather than criticism. The Lord keeps sending us people who need to remember what really matters, she'd observed, watching a former investment banker learn to plane a board smooth with hand tools. Good thing we have space for them. The bronze bell that crowned the barn was rung each evening at sunset, its clear tone carrying across the countryside as a reminder that another day of honest work was complete. David had come to cherish that sound, the way it marked time not by productivity or profit, but by the simple completion of tasks worth doing. It was a different rhythm than the relentless urgency that had characterized his former life, and he discovered he preferred it completely. His relationship with his ex-wife had improved as well, though she remained baffled by his transformation. "I don't understand what you found in that place," she'd said during one of their increasingly civil conversations. "But you seem happier than I've seen you in years. And Michael clearly loves working with you." The observation was accurate. David had found something in Benjamin's world that his previous success had never provided: sense of purpose that extended beyond personal achievement, work that served others rather than just accumulating wealth, connections to people, and place that would endure beyond his own lifetime. As he stood in the completed barn on this warm spring evening, watching Michael help Benjamin organize tools after another day's work, David reflected on the journey that had brought him here. Storm that destroyed the original barn had seemed like simple destruction, a random act of nature requiring reconstruction. But he understood now that some destruction cleared the way for something better, not just new buildings, but new ways of living, new definitions of success, new understanding of what it meant to build a life worth living. The handmade sign by the entrance bore both their names, but David knew the real memorial to this partnership wasn't carved in wood. It was carved in the lives they'd touched, the young people who'd learned that there were alternatives to the hollow pursuit of wealth, the community that had been strengthened by their shared labor. Benjamin approached as David stood lost in reflection, the older man's weathered face peaceful in the golden light of evening. "Regrets?" he asked simply, as if reading David's thoughts. David considered the question seriously. He'd lost millions of dollars, abandoned a business empire, given up a lifestyle most people envied. But looking at the barn they built together, at his son learning to be a craftsman rather than just another ambitious young man, at the community that had welcomed him despite his outsider status, he found his answer came without hesitation. "None," he said, and meant it completely. "For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm building something that actually matters." The bell rang out across the countryside, calling the scattered families home for evening meals and quiet conversations around kitchen tables. David and Michael walked together toward their truck, father and son united by shared purpose and honest work. Behind them, the barn stood strong against the darkening sky, ready to shelter whatever celebrations and sorrows the future might bring. Built to last not just for years, but for generations by men who had learned that the most important question wasn't how quickly you could build something, but whether it was worth building at all.